I was marched out of the building by armed security, while my boss popped champagne to celebrate my replacement. He looked me right in the eye and told me I was too old for the tech industry, claiming the 25-year-old taking my desk would finally fix my catastrophic mistakes. 50 hours later, that exact same replacement tried to open my project files and triggered a federal meltdown. They never knew the system keeping the company out of prison actually belonged to me. She called me 25 times. I never answered. I am Claire, 33 years old, and until a frosty Tuesday morning in Seattle, I was the director of data compliance at Apex Financial. Before I tell you how I brought a corrupt corporation to its knees and watched the people who betrayed me lose everything, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to smile through your teeth while toxic people dug their own graves. The heavy thud of security boots echoed against the polished marble floors of the Apex Financial lobby. It was exactly 8:15 in the morning. Two broad-shouldered men in dark uniforms flanked me, their expressions stony and impassive, as they escorted me down the main corridor. I held a single cardboard box in my hands. Inside were the meager remnants of my 3 years at the company: a framed photo, a coffee mug, and a few desk plants. Everything else, all my digital files, my contacts, my access badges had been wiped and deactivated before I even stepped off the elevator that morning. The entire floor was designed with floor-to-ceiling glass walls, an architectural choice meant to promote corporate transparency. Now that same transparency turned my exit into a public spectacle. Dozens of analysts, developers, and project managers stood at their ergonomic standing desks, watching me, being marched out like a criminal. Some averted their eyes in discomfort. Others stared with undisguised morbid curiosity. I kept my posture completely straight, my shoulders pulled back, and my gaze fixed forward. I refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing me break. I had given Apex Financial my absolute best. I built their compliance department from the ground up, working 70-hour weeks to ensure they passed every grueling federal audit. I navigated the labyrinth of data privacy laws so the executives could sleep soundly at night. And my reward for this relentless dedication was an ambush termination right before our company was set to go public. They were stealing my equity. They were erasing my contributions, and they were doing it with an audience. As my security escort guided me past the main executive boardroom, I saw them. The heavy glass double doors were propped wide open. Inside, standing at the head of the massive mahogany conference table, was Bradley Pierce. Bradley was 45 years old, wearing his signature custom-tailored suit that cost more than my first car. He held a bottle of imported champagne in one hand and a crystal flute in the other. The cork had just popped, and the golden liquid bubbled over the rim. Standing right beside him, completely radiant and practically glowing with unearned confidence, was Gwen. She was 25, fresh out of a master program, and completely inexperienced in high-level data security. But she had the one qualification that actually mattered at Apex Financial. She was the niece of a major shareholder. Bradley caught sight of me through the glass. Instead of looking away in shame, his chest puffed out. He set the bottle down, whispered something to Gwen that made her giggle, and stepped out of the boardroom to block my path to the elevators. The two security guards immediately stopped, their hands resting near their radios, creating a physical barricade between me and the exit. "Leaving so soon?" Claire Bradley asked, his voice dripping with condescension. His words carried easily down the quiet hallway, ensuring every nearby employee could hear. "You forgot to say goodbye to your successor." I gripped the edges of my cardboard box, feeling the rough paper dig into my palms. "I have nothing to say to either of you, Bradley. Just let me pass." He chuckled, stepping closer, invading my personal space. The scent of expensive cologne and alcohol wafted over me. "Do not be bitter, Claire. The tech industry moves fast. We simply needed someone with fresh, modern ideas to take us into the public offering. Someone with energy. He gestured back toward the boardroom where Gwen was sipping her champagne. Gwen will be cleaning up your mess. She has the pedigree we need for the next phase of our corporate expansion. You should view this as a favor. The workload was clearly becoming too much for you anyway. Good luck finding a tech job at your age. Maybe look into something slower paced. The sheer audacity of his words was meant to humiliate me. He wanted me to lash out. He wanted me to scream, to cry, to give him a reason to tell security, to physically drag me out of the building. He wanted to cement the narrative that I was an unstable, disgruntled former employee who could not handle the pressure of the corporate big leagues. I slowly turned my head to look past Bradley's shoulder. Inside the boardroom, Gwen was holding her crystal flute. She wore a smug, victorious smile, clearly enjoying the power trip of displacing a senior director. But as my eyes locked onto hers, I noticed a tiny, almost imperceptible detail. The champagne inside her glass was shaking. Despite her arrogant posture, her hands were trembling. She was terrified of the job she had just stolen. She had no idea how to run the systems I had built. She had no idea the sheer volume of federal scrutiny she was about to face. And most importantly, she had no idea that the very algorithm keeping this billion-dollar company alive did not actually belong to them. I did not yell. I did not drop my box. I did not utter a single word of protest or defense. Instead, I looked back at Bradley, then back at Gwen. I let the silence stretch for 5 agonizing seconds until Bradley's smug smile began to falter at the edges. Then I gave them a chilling, deadpan smile. It was a smile completely devoid of warmth, packed with the quiet certainty of a woman who held the detonator to their entire corporate empire. "You are absolutely right, Bradley," I said, my voice smooth and perfectly composed. "Gwen is going to have a lot of cleaning up to do. Enjoy the champagne." Before he could process the genuine lack of fear in my voice, I turned on my heel and walked directly past him. The security guard scrambled to keep up as I stepped into the waiting elevator. As the stainless steel doors began to slide shut, I caught one last glimpse of Bradley. He was no longer smiling. His brow was furrowed, a sudden flash of doubt crossing his features as he tried to figure out why his victim had just looked at him with absolute pity. The doors clicked shut, plunging me into the quiet hum of the descending elevator. The elevator descent felt like a transition between 2 different worlds. When the ground floor doors slid open, the warm, climate-controlled corporate environment vanished instantly. The security guards walked me directly to the heavy glass revolving doors, swiped their master key cards, and essentially shoved me out into the harsh reality of a Pacific Northwest morning. The heavy, unyielding Seattle rain immediately soaked through my thin silk blouse, plastering the fabric against my skin. I stood on the wet concrete pavement, shivering, as the icy wind whipped off the Puget Sound and cut straight through my professional attire. The dampness quickly seeped into the bottom of my cardboard box, threatening to tear the seams and spill my few personal belongings onto the muddy sidewalk. I looked up at the towering glass skyscraper. Somewhere up there, on the 40th floor, Bradley was passing around expensive champagne flutes, toasting to a future built entirely on my stolen labor. They were celebrating my departure, convinced they had neatly tied off the only loose end that could complicate their upcoming initial public offering. I shifted the weight of the box to my left hip and stepped under the slight overhang of a nearby bus shelter to block the worst of the rain. My hands were numb from the freezing temperatures, but I managed to reach into my pocket and pull out my phone. The screen illuminated, displaying a picture of my husband, Jason, smiling on our last vacation to Cabo. The natural instinct for anyone who had just been brutally terminated, stripped of their equity, and publicly humiliated would be to call their spouse. I stared at his contact name for a long time. I needed comfort. I needed a warm voice telling me that everything was going to be perfectly fine, that we would figure out the finances together, and that Bradley was just a corporate bully who got lucky. I almost tapped the green call button, but my thumb hovered over the glass. I stopped myself. Something deep inside my gut, a primal instinct honed by years of navigating high-stakes corporate environments, told me that calling Jason right now was a strategic mistake. He had been acting distant lately, overly concerned with our joint bank accounts, and strangely interested in the exact vesting schedule of my company's stock options. I did not need emotional platitudes right now. I needed cold, calculated leverage. I swiped away Jason's contact profile, banishing the picture of his smiling face back into the digital void. Comfort would have to wait. Survival was the immediate priority. Instead of my phone contacts, I opened a disguised utility folder hidden deep within my device settings. Inside sat a plain, unmarked black icon. I tapped it, bringing up a stark terminal interface requiring a 16-character alphanumeric passcode. My frozen fingers were stiff, making it difficult to type, but muscle memory took over. As I inputted the complex string of letters and numbers, a flood of memories crashed over me. My mind drifted back exactly 3 years. Long before Bradley Pierce ever wore custom suits, Apex Financial was drowning in federal compliance violations. The Securities and Exchange Commission was preparing to levy fines so massive they would have bankrupted the firm before it ever reached the public market. I remembered sitting in my unheated suburban garage, wrapped in 2 thick blankets, furiously typing lines of code until 3 in the morning, while Jason slept comfortably upstairs. I spent 6 agonizing months building a predictive compliance algorithm from absolute scratch. I designed an artificial intelligence engine capable of scanning millions of financial transactions in real time, automatically flagging and fixing regulatory anomalies before the federal auditors could ever detect them. I built the ultimate corporate shield. When I finally deployed the software at Apex, the results were instantaneous and miraculous. The federal fines vanished. The audit reports came back flawless. The board of directors threw a massive gala to celebrate the turnaround, and Bradley, my direct supervisor, stepped up to the podium and took absolute credit for the entire system. He accepted the bonuses, the promotions, and the magazine interviews, treating me like a glorified IT assistant who merely executed his brilliant vision. He thought I was just a naive, hardworking woman who was too intimidated by corporate politics to demand her rightful due. But Bradley lacked a fundamental understanding of how proprietary software actually worked. He never bothered to read the fine print of my original employment contract, nor did he understand the intricate deployment structure I used to install the algorithm onto the Apex servers. I did not just hand over the keys to the kingdom. I retained ultimate administrative control. My phone screen flashed green, indicating the passcode was accepted. The terminal interface melted away, replaced by a sleek, minimalist dashboard displaying the live operational status of the Apex Financial Compliance Network. A series of green lights confirmed that my algorithm was currently processing thousands of transactions per second, keeping the company fully compliant with federal law. At the very bottom of the screen sat a single bold red button labeled Protocol Alpha. I stared at the button, the rain continuing to beat down on the bus shelter roof above me. Pressing it meant declaring total war. It meant burning down the bridge and forcing a catastrophic corporate reckoning. I thought about Gwen drinking champagne at my desk. I thought about Bradley mocking my age. I took a deep breath, letting the icy Seattle air fill my lungs, and pressed the red button. A confirmation prompt appeared. I hit confirm. The green lights on the dashboard instantly blinked out. In their place, a stark white timer appeared on the screen, locking my device from any further input. The timer read 48 hours, 0 minutes, and 0 seconds. That was exactly how long Apex had before the system permanently severed its connection, leaving them completely blind to the federal auditors. Then it ticked down by 1 second. The dominoes had officially been pushed, and there was absolutely no turning back. I slipped my phone back into my damp coat pocket. The screen went dark entirely, but the stark image of that white ticking countdown burned brightly in my mind. I flagged down a passing premium rideshare vehicle, completely ignoring the exorbitant morning surge pricing. The driver took one single look at my drenched clothes and shivering frame, immediately turning up the heated leather seats to their maximum capacity. The artificial heat radiated through my soaked skirt, but the warmth could not penetrate the absolute block of ice that had settled deep in my chest. I watched the gray, rain-slicked Seattle skyline fade quickly in the rearview mirror, replaced gradually by the manicured, affluent tranquility of the expensive suburban neighborhood Jason and I called home. The sprawling properties sat quietly behind perfectly trimmed privacy hedges, projecting a flawless illusion of domestic bliss and ultimate security. I just wanted a scalding hot shower. I wanted to stand under the running water until the humiliation of the morning washed down the drain. I carried my soggy cardboard box up the immaculate brick pathway to our heavy oak front door, my fingers fumbling awkwardly with the keys due to the freezing ambient temperature. The lock clicked open loudly. I pushed the door inward, fully expecting the familiar, comforting silence of our meticulously decorated foyer. Instead, the atmosphere inside the house felt suffocatingly dense, charged with a strange, highly hostile energy that made the hairs on my arms stand up. Before I could even set my dripping box down on the mahogany console table, I saw them. Lined up perfectly against the expensive wainscoting were 3 massive Louis Vuitton suitcases. The signature monogram canvas and gleaming brass hardware mocked me in the dim entryway light. They were Jason's bags. He had insisted on buying the entire luxury luggage set last year, using my annual performance bonus, claiming a man of his corporate stature needed to travel with appropriate worldly prestige. The sight of them fully packed on a random Tuesday morning made my heart seek a painful, erratic beat. My wet shoes squeaked loudly against the pristine hardwood floors as I stepped further inside, cold water dripping constantly from my hair onto the expensive Persian rug. The sharp, rhythmic clicking of leather dress shoes descending the wooden staircase suddenly broke the heavy silence. I looked up. Jason was walking down the steps, his posture incredibly rigid and his expression entirely devoid of any human emotion. He was 35 years old and obsessed with his physical appearance to an almost pathological degree. He wore a crisp, tailored charcoal suit that accentuated his broad shoulders, and his dark hair was styled with absolute salon precision. He did not rush forward to greet me. He did not ask why his wife was standing in the hallway, hours before her usual schedule. He did not even flinch at the sight of me standing there violently shivering, soaked to the bone, clutching a pathetic cardboard box filled with cheap office supplies. Instead, his hands casually moved to the collar of his expensive silk shirt, meticulously adjusting his designer tie into a flawless Windsor knot. His dark eyes swept over my ruined clothes, registering my pathetic physical state with the detached, mild annoyance one might reserve for a stray animal tracking mud onto a freshly cleaned porch. "You are home early," he stated flatly. It was not a question. The monotone delivery of his voice sent a new kind of chill directly through my veins, one that had absolutely nothing to do with the freezing Seattle weather outside. I tightened my grip on the bottom of the damp cardboard box, feeling the material giving way. "Bradley fired me," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level, despite the violent trembling in my hands. "Security escorted me out of the building an hour ago." I watched his handsome face closely, waiting for the shock The outrage, the protective anger a loyal husband should instinctively display when his wife is brutally discarded by corporate executives. I received none of those things. Not a single muscle in his jaw twitched. His dark eyes remained completely impassive, reflecting nothing but cool calculation. "I know," Jason replied smoothly. The two casual words struck my chest like a physical blow. The heavy box nearly slipped from my frozen fingers. "You know," I repeated, my voice dropping to a harsh, raspy whisper. "How could you possibly know that I was dragged out of the main lobby less than an hour ago? I have not called anyone. I have not spoken to a single soul since I left the building." Jason finally finished adjusting his perfect tie and slid his hands into his tailored trouser pockets. He descended the final 2 steps and walked slowly past me directly into our custom designer kitchen. He moved with a relaxed, arrogant swagger that made my stomach churn violently. Word travels incredibly fast in the financial sector. "Claire," he called carelessly over his shoulder. I followed him into the kitchen, dropping my ruined box onto the pristine granite countertop with a heavy thud. He winced visibly at the muddy mess I made on the expensive stone surface. "You need to take off those wet shoes," he admonished, coldly pointing a finger at my feet. "You are completely ruining the finish on the custom floors." I stared at the man I had shared a bed with for 5 years, suddenly realizing I was looking at a complete stranger. "My entire career was just assassinated," I fired back, refusing to break eye contact or move. "And you are worried about the hardwood floors?" Jason leaned casually against the stainless steel refrigerator, crossing his arms tightly over his chest. "This is exactly the kind of hysterical overreaction that makes living and working with you utterly impossible," he sneered, his lip curling upward. "You have been completely obsessed with that compliance algorithm for 3 years. You totally ignored your marriage, you neglected our social life, you made yourself entirely unlikable to upper management because you refused to play the corporate game. Frankly, it was only a matter of time before Bradley found someone younger, more agreeable, and far less toxic to replace you." The aggressive gaslighting was so blatantly cruel that it momentarily robbed me of my breath. He was using the exact same corporate buzzwords Bradley had weaponized against me just an hour earlier in the hallway. He was entirely unsympathetic, brutally analytical, and completely devoid of any basic compassion. It was a calculated, synchronized psychological attack. "You are defending the man who just stole my equity," I stated, the dark reality of the situation finally crystallizing in my logical mind. "You packed your bags. You knew I was walking into a termination ambush this morning, and you used the opportunity to pack your luggage while I was being humiliated. Are you going on a business trip?" Jason uncrossed his arms and pushed himself away from the refrigerator door. He walked slowly over to the center of the kitchen island, his polished shoes echoing loudly against the ceramic tile. He reached into the inner breast pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out a thick, legal-sized manila folder. His expression shifted rapidly from detached annoyance to outright malice. The smug, self-satisfied smirk that crept across his handsome face was the ugliest thing I had ever witnessed in my entire life. He slammed the heavy folder down onto the granite countertop with a loud smack. He placed his perfectly manicured hand flat against the coarse paper and pushed it forcefully across the smooth stone surface until it stopped, just inches from my frozen fingertips. "I am not going on a business trip, Claire," Jason said, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper-quiet cadence. "I am filing for divorce. I want you out by Sunday." I stared down at the heavy manila folder resting on the wet granite countertop. The bold black letters across the top sheet blurred slightly as my exhausted brain struggled to process the sheer velocity of the betrayal. Divorce. It was a word that felt completely alien in our meticulously curated suburban life. I slowly lifted my gaze from the legal paperwork to meet his eyes. There was absolutely zero hesitation in his posture. He looked utterly triumphant, basking in the glow of my sudden downfall. You spent 3 entire years married to a corporate laptop Claire. Jason spat, his voice laced with a practiced venomous pity. Do not stand there looking like a tragic victim. You brought this entirely on yourself. You missed our wedding anniversaries. You canceled our luxury vacations. You obsessed over server logs, data privacy laws, and federal compliance protocols while our marriage rotted from the inside out. I needed a supportive wife. You decided to be a soulless corporate drone, and look exactly where that got you. Fired, humiliated, and absolutely alone. His psychological warfare was flawlessly executed. He wanted me to internalize the blame. He wanted me to believe that my relentless work ethic, the very work ethic that paid the exorbitant mortgage for this pristine house, was a toxic character flaw that fully justified his betrayal. I kept my breathing shallow and even, refusing to give him the emotional breakdown he so desperately craved. You planned this down to the very minute, I said, my voice cutting through his rehearsed monologue with absolute chilling precision. You waited until Bradley executed the termination, so I would have zero leverage. Jason chuckled, a dry, humorless sound that echoed off the high-vaulted ceiling. Leverage is for people who actually hold cards, Claire. You do not hold anything anymore. He casually reached into the pocket of his tailored slacks and pulled out his sleek smartphone. He held the device up so I could clearly see the screen, though I could not read the text from that distance. With exaggerated theatrical flair, he tapped his index finger against the glass exactly once. A second later, my own phone vibrated violently inside my damp coat pocket. The sudden mechanical buzz felt like a wasp trapped against my hip. I slowly pulled the device out with my frozen fingers and looked at the lock screen. It was an automated fraud alert from our primary banking institution. The notification stared back at me in stark white text. An outgoing wire transfer of $120,000 had just been successfully processed and cleared. Our joint savings account, the financial safety net we had spent half a decade building together, now held a balance of exactly $0.00. I looked up from the glowing screen. He had drained every single penny. He executed the transfer the exact moment he knew my corporate access was permanently revoked. That is grand theft, Jason. I stated, my analytical brain rapidly compartmentalizing the massive financial shock. That money was a joint marital asset. Actually, it is legally not, Jason countered smoothly, stepping forward to tap his manicured fingernail directly against the thick manila folder on the counter. Did you conveniently forget the legal paperwork we signed before we stood at the altar? I certainly did not. He was referring to the prenuptial agreement. 5 years ago, Jason was an ambitious junior executive, terrified of losing his potential future earnings. He had cornered me in a high-rise lawyer office 3 weeks before our wedding, demanding a ruthlessly protective contract. He insisted that whatever individual wealth or business ventures either of us brought into the marriage or created during it would remain absolutely sole and separate property. He wanted to entirely shield his own future assets from what he called marital liabilities. I had signed it blindly because I loved him and believed we were building a partnership. The prenup explicitly dictates that whoever controls the origin of the funds retains total legal ownership, Jason bragged, leaning heavily over the kitchen island. I transferred my annual performance bonuses into that joint account last week. My bonuses, my money. You have been too busy playing cybersecurity guard to track the deposit history. I simply moved my legal property into a private offshore account beyond your reach. The house is deeded under my initial down payment. The cash is mine. The cars are mine. The prenuptial agreement is completely ironclad, Claire. You are walking out of this marriage with absolutely nothing but the wet clothes on your back. He smiled a wide, predatory grin, showcasing his expensive dental veneers. He truly believed he had orchestrated the perfect crime. He believed he had legally cornered a desperate, newly unemployed woman and stripped her of every available resource. He expected me to fall to my knees in panic. He expected me to beg for a meager settlement just to survive the month. Instead, my mind shifted into a state of absolute, hyper-focused clarity. I looked down at the manila folder. I thought about the exact, specific phrasing of that prenuptial agreement. Jason had hired an aggressive legal team to ensure that any business entity formed under an individual name remained the untouchable sole property of the founder. He designed the ultimate financial shield to protect his own greed. He had absolutely no idea he had just handed me an invincible sword. Before either of us could speak another word, the low, aggressive growl of a high-performance engine shattered the quiet suburban morning. A sleek, midnight black sports car pulled sharply into our concrete driveway, the tires screeching slightly against the wet pavement. The driver, a young blonde woman, wearing oversized designer sunglasses, leaned heavily on the steering wheel. The sharp, obnoxious horn blasted through the freezing rain, echoing loudly off the expensive brick houses in our quiet cul-de-sac. Jason did not even bother to look out the window. His smile widened into something genuinely cruel. He turned his back on me completely, grabbing the heavy leather handles of his 3 massive Louis Vuitton suitcases. "My new fiancé is waiting," Jason said, hoisting the luxury bags with practiced ease. "Have your garbage cleared out of my house by Sunday, Claire. If you leave a mess behind, I will bill your credit card for the cleaning crew. Assuming your cards still work." He walked out the front door without a single backward glance, the heavy oak door slamming shut behind him with a resonant final thud. I stood, completely alone in the freezing, silent kitchen, shivering violently in my ruined professional clothes. The rain continued to beat heavily against the large picture windows. I did not bother looking outside at the sports car speeding away down the street. Instead, I slowly reached out and placed my freezing, trembling hand over the thick divorce folder. My eyes locked onto the dense legal text of the prenuptial agreement attached to the front page. Jason thought he had used this brilliant legal document to leave me entirely penniless. He had completely forgotten that the vital compliance software currently holding his precious Apex Financial together was registered to an independent corporate entity solely under my name. My analytical mind began calculating the precise lethal counterstrike. Catherine never used the word emergency lightly. In her meticulously curated world of country club luncheons and charity galas, an emergency usually meant a perceived social slight, a delayed catering order, or someone wearing the wrong shade of white to a summer party. But the absolute brevity of the message, combined with the command to meet at the most expensive, exclusive steakhouse in downtown Seattle, signaled something entirely different. A tiny, foolish spark of irrational hope flared deep in my chest. Perhaps Jason had called her. Perhaps my mother, despite our strained history and her blatant, unapologetic favoritism toward my younger sister, was actually rallying the family to support me through this catastrophic morning. I left the divorce papers sitting right where Jason had slammed them down. I marched up the wooden stairs, stripped off my ruined, rain-soaked silk blouse, and stepped into a scalding hot shower. The hot water stung my freezing skin, but I only allowed myself exactly 5 minutes to thaw. I needed physical armor for whatever was coming. I dressed in a razor-sharp tailored suit, the exact kind of outfit that projected absolute impenetrable authority. I applied my makeup with clinical precision, hiding the dark circles of exhaustion under a layer of flawless foundation. If I was walking into a family crisis, I absolutely refused to look like a defeated, broken victim. The drive downtown was a blur of gray skies and slick rain-swept pavement. Capitol Grill sat prominently in the financial district, a grand bastion of old money and ruthless corporate power. I handed my keys to the valet in the pouring rain and pushed through the heavy brass front doors. The air inside immediately enveloped me, smelling intensely of aged leather, expensive cigars, and roasted prime rib. The ambient noise was a low, steady hum of wealthy patrons closing lucrative deals over midday martinis. It was a world perfectly designed for people like Bradley and Jason. People who genuinely believed money could insulate them from basic human decency. The hostess, a young woman with a practiced, brilliant smile, greeted me at the dark mahogany podium. "I am here for Catherine," I told her, keeping my voice perfectly steady. Recognition flashed immediately in her eyes. "Ah, yes, they are waiting for you in the private dining room at the back. Please follow me." I walked behind her, my heels sinking slightly into the thick, plush carpet. The private rooms at Capitol Grill were entirely enclosed spaces, reserved for high-stakes negotiations or exclusive, secretive celebrations, requiring a massive minimum spend just to book the table. The idea that my mother had secured one on a random Tuesday afternoon suggested a level of intense orchestration that sent a sudden, icy warning down my spine. The hostess stopped before a set of heavy, frosted glass doors framed in dark, polished wood. She pushed the right door open and stepped aside respectfully. I walked into the room fully prepared to ask my mother what terrible medical or financial disaster had prompted this sudden dramatic gathering. The words instantly died in my throat. The scene before me was a perfectly arranged, surreal painting of absolute, devastating betrayal. The private dining room was illuminated by a low-hanging crystal chandelier that cast a warm, golden glow across the long, polished wooden table. Sitting at the very head of the table was Catherine. She wore a pristine white designer blazer, her blonde hair styled into an immovable, perfect helmet. She did not rush forward to hug her newly unemployed divorcing daughter. She simply swirled the red wine in her glass, her face a mask of mild aristocratic boredom. Seated directly to her right was my younger sister Olivia. At 30 years old, Olivia was the undisputed golden child of our family, the one whose minor achievements were always celebrated with massive fanfare, while my major milestones were casually ignored. She wore a diamond tennis bracelet that caught the chandelier light, projecting the exact kind of passive-aggressive luxury she specialized in. Olivia looked at me and offered a tight, sympathetic pout that was entirely devoid of any actual human warmth. Beside Olivia sat her husband, Andre. At 36, Andre was a massive titan in the Seattle tech world, a highly successful African-American venture capitalist who moved corporate markets with a single phone call. He wore a bespoke navy suit that screamed immense wealth and intimidating power. Andre radiated an aura of ruthless ambition. He was leaning back in his thick leather chair, looking incredibly relaxed, completely at home in the high-stakes environment of the private room. But it was the man sitting directly across from Andre that made the blood in my veins run completely cold. Jason, my husband. The man who had walked out of our house less than 2 hours ago, claiming he was going to meet his new fiancée, was sitting comfortably at my family table. He had a leather-bound menu open in front of him, looking as though he were merely deciding between the ribeye and the filet mignon. He was not just leaving me. He was actively collaborating with my own flesh and blood. The sheer audacity of the ambush locked my feet to the thick carpet. The heavy wooden door clicked shut behind me, cutting off the ambient noise of the restaurant and sealing me inside the room with the 4 people who represented the complete destruction of my personal and professional life. My mother had not summoned me to offer maternal support. She had summoned me to an execution. I looked from Catherine to Olivia, searching for any hint of shame or guilt. There was absolutely none. They looked at me with the identical, detached calculation of spectators watching a slow-motion car crash. Jason kept his eyes glued to the menu, far too much of a coward to meet my gaze directly. The tension in the room was absolute thick enough to physically suffocate. Nobody spoke. The silence stretched heavy and deliberate, designed as a psychological tactic to make me break first, to make me demand answers or burst into tears. I stood perfectly still, letting my eyes sweep across the faces of my betrayers, locking my breathing into a slow, measured rhythm. Finally, the silence was broken. Andre reached forward with a slow, deliberate movement. He picked up his large crystal glass filled with a $500 vintage Pinot Noir. He swirled the dark crimson liquid gently, admiring the way it coated the sides of the glass. Then he lifted his chin and looked me dead in the eye. His expression was completely unreadable, a masterclass in corporate stoicism. A slow, chilling smile spread across his face, revealing a row of perfect white teeth. "Take a seat," Claire Andre said, his deep voice echoing off the mahogany walls. "We have business to discuss." I did not immediately pull out the heavy leather chair. I stood perfectly still, forcing Andre to maintain his perfectly calculated predatory smile just a fraction of a second longer than was socially comfortable. I glanced at my mother, Catherine, who actively avoided my eyes by taking a slow, deliberate sip of her expensive white wine. I looked at Olivia, whose hand rested possessively on Andre's forearm, radiating a toxic, unearned pride in her husband's ruthless authority. Jason remained hyper-focused on his leather-bound menu, a pathetic display of cowardice from a man who had confidently drained my bank account mere hours ago. With absolute icy composure, I pulled the heavy chair back and sat down directly across from my brother-in-law. The polished mahogany table felt like a physical battlefield separating us. I placed my hands flat on the smooth wood, interlaced my fingers, and waited for the executioner to read my sentence. Andre steepled his fingers, leaning forward into the warm light of the crystal chandelier. His dark, intelligent eyes studied me, with the clinical detachment of a titan observing cornered prey. He clearly expected me to demand answers to shout, or to break down crying in front of my family. When I offered him nothing but absolute silence, he decided to begin his presentation. "You have always been an incredibly talented data director," Claire Andre began, his tone dripping with the faux admiration of a corporate shark. "Your technical skills are practically unmatched in the Seattle sector. But you severely lack basic strategic vision. You view compliance as a rigid set of rules to follow blindly. I view it as a flexible obstacle to be managed. 2 weeks ago, my venture capital firm finalized the acquisition of a 20% controlling stake in Apex Financial." The words struck the air with physical force, but I kept my breathing entirely even. The pieces of the puzzle slammed into place with terrifying speed. Andre had not just married into my family, he had quietly bought his way into the highest echelons of my professional life, wielding his wealth to dismantle my career from the shadows. When we audited the Apex operational structure ahead of the upcoming initial public offering, I realized we had a massive liability on our hands. Andre continued smoothly adjusting his expensive cuffs. "That liability was you." "You are far too rigid, Claire. You would never sign off on the creative accounting and streamlined data reports required to inflate the company valuation before we go public. Bradley Pierce is a useful idiot who eagerly follows orders, but you were a brick wall. So I picked up the phone, called Bradley, and gave him a direct, non-negotiable order to terminate your employment effectively immediately." He was more than happy to oblige, especially since it allowed him to take sole credit for the clean system architecture you built over the last 3 years. Olivia offered a soft, mocking laugh from across the table, clearly enjoying the systematic dismantling of my professional career. I ignored her completely, keeping my eyes locked onto Andre. "You replaced me with a 25-year-old junior analyst," I state. and my voice completely devoid of emotion. Gwen has zero experience managing high-level federal compliance protocols. Your venture capital firm just invested $100 million into a company you intentionally left completely vulnerable to a federal audit. Andre smiled, shaking his head slowly as if disappointed by my lack of corporate imagination. You really do not see the bigger picture, do you? We did not hire Gwen to actually run the compliance network. We hired Gwen because her father is the senior director of the Regional Securities and Exchange Commission Audit Division, the exact same division that is legally required to approve the Apex Financial public offering next month. By placing his severely underqualified daughter in a highly lucrative director position, we essentially guaranteed the federal auditors will rubber stamp our public offering without looking too closely at the underlying financial data. We bought federal clearance, Claire. Gwen is not your replacement. She is simply a highly paid human bribe. You were just collateral damage in a much larger, much more lucrative game of chess. I finally turned my cold gaze toward the end of the table. Jason was suddenly looking very interested in his polished dress shoes, refusing to acknowledge the devastation unfolding right in front of him. And you brought my husband into your corporate conspiracy. I said the words, slicing through the heavy air of the private dining room. Andre chuckled, an arrogant, booming sound that made my mother smile in immediate, sickening approval. Jason is a practical man, Andre explained, gesturing casually toward my soon-to-be ex-husband. I knew that firing you right before the public offering would cause a massive shift in your domestic financial situation, as a courtesy to my brother-in-law. I gave Jason a 48-hour advance warning about your sudden termination. I advised him to secure his personal assets before your income dried up completely. I gave him the strategic window he needed to legally drain your joint accounts and leverage that ironclad prenuptial agreement you foolishly signed 5 years ago. Jason essentially rode my coattails to a 6-figure payday. He made a smart business decision, Claire. You really cannot blame him for protecting his own future when you were failing to protect yours. The sheer, breathtaking cruelty of the coordinated attack was staggering. My own mother and sister had gathered around this luxurious table to celebrate my complete financial and professional destruction. They watched Andre methodically detail how he had orchestrated my firing, compromised federal security regulations, and weaponized my own husband against me, all in the name of unrestrained corporate greed. Andre reached into his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a crisp, white, legal document. He placed it flat on the table and casually slid the non-disclosure agreement across the polished mahogany until it rested directly in front of my hands. He picked up his wineglass once more, taking a slow, victorious sip before delivering his final insult. Sign this, walk away quietly, and I will make sure Jason leaves you with a little severance from the divorce. I stared at the stark white non-disclosure agreement resting on the mahogany table. The arrogance of the document was only matched by the man who had slid it toward me. But before addressing the venture capitalist who had orchestrated my professional assassination, I slowly turned my gaze to the woman sitting at the head of the table. I looked directly at Catherine, my mother, the woman who had given birth to me, who had summoned me to this ambush disguised as a family dinner. A tiny, irrational fraction of my heart still expected her to intervene. I waited for her to slam her hand on the table to demand how her son-in-law could possibly treat her eldest daughter with such breathtaking cruelty. I waited for maternal outrage. Instead, Catherine calmly picked up a silver dessert spoon, inspected her reflection in the polished metal, and set it down with a soft, dismissive clink. Catherine met my eyes with a chilling lack of empathy. Her expression was completely devoid of maternal warmth, replaced entirely by the calculating gaze of a social climber protecting her most valuable assets. She adjusted the heavy diamond necklace resting against her collarbone, a gift Andre had purchased for her last Christmas, explicitly bought to secure her absolute loyalty. Catherine sighed, a long, theatrical sound of profound disappointment. Blood is thicker than water, Claire, but business is business. You should have been more accommodating to your superiors. Learn from Olivia. She knows how to navigate the world of successful men without making herself an obstacle. You have always been far too aggressive for your own good. It makes people uncomfortable. Andre simply made a necessary corporate decision, and you are throwing a childish tantrum instead of accepting reality. The pure, unadulterated gaslighting physically repulsed me. She was actively defending the man who had arranged my firing and the husband who had stolen my life savings, framing my absolute devastation as a mere personality flaw. Olivia immediately seized the opportunity to join the psychological attack. She leaned forward, the diamond tennis bracelet catching the ambient light of the chandelier, and offered a thoroughly patronizing smile. "Mom is right," Claire Olivia chimed in, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "You have to understand that high-level finance requires teamwork. Andre is operating on a scale you simply do not comprehend. You were holding his investments back. Honestly, you should be thanking him for the severance offer. If you sign the paperwork, maybe Jason will be generous enough to cover your first month of rent at a new apartment. You cannot expect to keep the house when you have no income. You just need to learn how to play the game better." I looked at my younger sister, the undisputed golden child, who had never worked a 70-hour week in her entire life. Olivia had spent her 20s bouncing between expensive European vacations and failed startup ideas, all funded by my mother, and later heavily subsidized by Andre. She sat there lecturing me on corporate strategy and financial responsibility while wearing a silk dress that cost more than my first car. The sheer hypocrisy of her lecture broke the final fraying tether of my patience. The cold, analytical fury inside me crystallized into an absolute weapon. I did not raise my voice. I did not slam my fists on the polished wood. I simply folded my hands together and leaned closer to Olivia. "Play the game better," I repeated, my voice dropping to a terrifyingly soft cadence that immediately erased the smug smile from Olivia's face. That is fascinating advice coming from someone whose entire adult existence is built exclusively on my credit score. Did you conveniently forget how you funded that expensive Ivy League degree you love to brag about to your country club friends? Because I remember exactly how it happened. I remember Mother cornering me in my tiny studio apartment a decade ago, crying and begging me to co-sign your massive private student loans because her own credit was completely ruined. I took on $100,000 of crippling legal liability at 23 years old, so you could go to college and fail every single business class you registered for. The color instantly drained from Olivia's face. Her jaw tightened, and she glanced nervously at Andre, who suddenly looked very interested in the stem of his wine glass. Clearly, the golden child had carefully omitted her disastrous financial history from her wealthy husband. Catherine bristled her posture, going rigid with sudden indignation. "That is ancient history," Claire Catherine snapped her voice, pitching higher in defense of her favorite daughter. "We are a family. We help each other. You are acting completely unhinged bringing up the past when we are trying to solve your current unemployment crisis." "You are not a family," I stated, my gaze sweeping across the four faces at the table. "You are a syndicate of parasites. You use the word blood when it benefits your bank accounts, and you use the word business when you want to destroy someone who stops serving your greed. You arranged this entire dinner to break my spirit. You wanted to watch me surrender. You wanted me to sign away my rights so Andre could execute his fraudulent public offering and Jason could walk away with my money without a legal fight." Andre chuckled, picking up his expensive gold pen and tapping it impatiently against the non-disclosure agreement. Insults will not change your bank balance, Claire. I control the board at Apex. Jason controls your marital assets. Your mother and sister agree with my methods. You are entirely out of options. Sign the paperwork and retain a shred of dignity. I looked down at the legal document resting on the polished wood. I thought about the white timer currently counting down on my encrypted phone. I thought about the massive, ticking time bomb sitting quietly in the Apex financial server room. A bomb that nobody at this table even realized existed. They truly thought they held all the power. They were absolutely blind to the execution I had already initiated. I slowly stood up from the heavy leather chair. The movement was so calm and deliberate that Jason actually flinched instinctively, pulling his menu up as if I might throw something at him. I reached into the inner pocket of my tailored blazer and pulled out my slim leather wallet. I extracted a crisp $50 bill. I held it up to the light, ensuring every single person at the table was watching my exact movements. With a fluid, precise motion, I reached across the mahogany table and dropped the bill directly into Jason's crystal water glass. The paper money floated for a second before sinking heavily into the ice water. "Enjoy the steak," I said, making sure my voice carried clearly to every corner of the private room. "It is the last expensive meal any of you will ever eat." I turned my back on them and walked directly toward the heavy, frosted glass doors. As I pushed the door open, to leave the sound of Andre's deep, arrogant laughter erupted behind me. Catherine and Olivia immediately joined in, giggling loudly at what they perceived to be the pathetic, empty threats of a defeated woman. Jason scoffed, muttering a joke about my dramatic exit. They were actively celebrating their absolute victory. I stepped out into the hallway, letting the heavy doors click shut, sealing their toxic laughter inside the room. They had absolutely no idea the countdown was already approaching the final 36 hours. I walked out of Capitol Grill and immediately flagged down a passing town car. The rain had intensified, washing the downtown Seattle streets in a cold, gray wash, but I felt absolutely nothing. No tears, no regret, just the cold, mechanical hum of a perfectly designed strategy locking into place. I instructed the driver to take me to the Grand Sovereign, the most exclusive luxury hotel in the financial district. I walked up to the polished marble reception desk and booked their executive corner suite. When the concierge asked for a payment method, I did not hand him the joint credit card Jason was currently monitoring. Instead, I retrieved a heavy matte black corporate card from a hidden compartment in my wallet. It was tied to a private account that neither my husband nor my mother knew existed. The executive suite was on the 42nd floor, a sprawling expanse of minimalist luxury, floor-to-ceiling windows, and absolute impenetrable silence. I locked the heavy oak door, engaged the deadbolt, and flipped the security latch. For the first time all day, I was completely alone. I took off my damp, tailored blazer, draped it carefully over the back of a velvet armchair, and walked straight to the massive glass dining table in the center of the room. I pulled my encrypted laptop from my bag and set it on the glass surface. The device booted up in complete silence. I bypassed the standard login screens, accessing the secure partition drive I used exclusively for high-level development. I ran my fingers over the keyboard, executing a complex series of commands to establish an untraceable virtual private network. A terminal window flared to life on the screen. The stark white countdown timer I had initiated at the bus shelter appeared, glowing ominously against the black background. It read exactly 36 hours, 0 minutes, and 0 seconds. I did not waste a single moment staring at the numbers. I opened a secure encrypted communication channel and initiated an emergency video call. The line rang twice before the screen populated with the sharp, alert face of my corporate attorney, Harrison. He was sitting in his high-rise office, surrounded by stacks of legal briefs, looking entirely unfazed by the sudden weekend summons. Harrison was not a family lawyer. He was an apex predator in the realm of intellectual property and corporate litigation, the kind of man who dismantled tech conglomerates for a living. "I was escorted out of the building this morning, Harrison," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. "Bradley Pierce executed a hostile termination without cause. My husband has drained my marital accounts, and Andre just confessed to manipulating the board to secure an unhindered initial public offering. They believe they have completely isolated me." Harrison leaned back in his leather chair, a slow, incredibly dangerous smile spreading across his face. He adjusted his glasses and pulled a thick legal binder toward the center of his desk. "They fired you without cause," he verified, his tone sharpening with predatory interest. "They actually handed you a formal termination notice without conducting a technical review of the vendor agreements." "They did," I confirmed. Bradley was too busy popping champagne to read the fine print. Andre was too focused on the stock valuation to audit the origin of the compliance architecture. They assume the software running the company's servers is proprietary corporate property. Harrison chuckled, a dry sound that conveyed absolute professional satisfaction. He opened the binder and ran his finger down a highlighted page of a highly complex software licensing contract. "The sheer arrogance of venture capitalists never ceases to amaze me," Harrison stated. "They throw around hundreds of millions of dollars, yet they never bother to read the underlying intellectual property filings. Let us review the facts for the record, Claire. Apex Financial does not own the compliance algorithm protecting them from the Securities and Exchange Commission. They have never owned it." I watched the timer on my screen drop another minute, confirming the inevitable. "That is correct," I replied smoothly. "I built the entire predictive compliance engine in my garage on my own personal hardware, entirely outside of corporate hours, long before I ever accepted the director position at Apex, before I deployed a single line of code to their servers. I legally registered the intellectual property under a completely separate independent shell company, Aegis Data Solutions, LLC," Harrison recited, tapping the legal incorporation document on his desk. "An entity wherein you are the sole founder, the sole shareholder, and the sole legal owner. When Bradley brought you on as the Director of Data Compliance, you did not hand over the software. You simply drafted a corporate agreement wherein Aegis Data Solutions, LLC leased a temporary conditional license to Apex Financial. You allowed them to use your shield. You never sold them the armor." "Exactly," I said. "And Andre just orchestrated the termination of the only person holding the administrative keys to that lease. They replaced me with a junior auditor because they need a puppet to pass the federal inspection on Monday morning. They are relying on my algorithm to hide their inflated valuations from the federal agents." Harrison leaned forward, his eyes locking onto the camera lens with absolute, chilling certainty. "The legal trap you designed is flawless, Claire. I am looking at Section 4, Paragraph B of the Vendor Licensing Agreement right now. The contract explicitly mandates that the software lease remains active exclusively while the author, meaning you, remains actively employed by the licensee in a supervisory capacity. If you are terminated without cause, the contract does not require a manual cancellation. The termination of employment automatically triggers a breach of contract protocol." I watched the digital clock ticking down on my monitor. The numbers were entirely unforgiving. A relentless march toward corporate destruction. I coded a deadman switch into the primary server architecture, I explained, detailing the technical execution of my legal trap. The moment Bradley revoked my employee credentials this morning, the system registered the breach of contract. I initiated the final sequence from my phone. It is a completely automated process now. The algorithm is currently severing its integration with the Apex databases, encrypting every single line of code and wiping the local storage clean. Harrison nodded, closing the heavy legal binder with a resonant snap that echoed through the computer speakers. He picked up his gold pen, pointing it directly at the camera. Per your contract, if you are terminated without cause, the license is revoked automatically, Harrison confirmed, his voice echoing the absolute finality of a judge delivering a sentence. They have no legal recourse. They have no technical backup. They just fired the only vendor keeping them compliant with federal law. At 8 o'clock on Monday morning, Apex loses its entire security infrastructure. I leaned back in the velvet chair, letting the sheer magnitude of the impending devastation wash over me. The hotel suite was entirely quiet, save for the faint sound of the Seattle rain lashing against the reinforced glass windows. In exactly 36 hours, the Securities and Exchange Commission agents would walk into the Apex lobby expecting a perfectly sanitized database. Instead, they would find a completely exposed, unprotected network bleeding illegal transactions and fraudulent valuations for the entire federal government to see. "Prepare the cease and desist orders, Harris and I," instructed my voice, dropping to a whisper of pure ice, "and draft a formal notification to the Federal Cybercrimes Division. If they try to hack into my intellectual property to turn the servers back on, I want them charged with federal espionage." "Consider it done," Harrison replied, his smile returning. "Get some sleep, Claire. Monday is going to be a bloodbath." The video call disconnected, leaving me alone with the glowing numbers on my screen. I reached for my cup of tea, perfectly calm, as the timer ticked down another agonizing second. I spent the remainder of Friday evening and the entirety of Saturday transforming the luxury executive suite into a heavily fortified corporate war room. I ordered room service and barely touched it, fueling my body entirely on black coffee and sheer adrenaline. There was no time for tears. There was absolutely no space for self-pity. Every single ounce of emotional labor I had previously exhausted attempting to please my mother, support my husband, and placate my toxic family was now systematically weaponized into pure corporate strategy. I opened a secure encrypted document and began drafting the cease and desist letters alongside Harrison. We mapped out the exact federal statutes Bradley and Andre would violate the moment they inevitably attempted to bypass my software revocation. We prepared automated legal notices addressed directly to the Securities and Exchange Commission, ready to deploy from my outbox the second my algorithm shut down. But I did not just play defense. I went on a calculated offensive. Saturday afternoon, I utilized a secure satellite connection to arrange a highly confidential video conference with the Chief Executive Officer of Zenith Financial. Zenith was Apex's largest and most aggressive industry competitor. They had been struggling for years to develop an internal compliance engine capable of matching the speed of my algorithm. I did not offer them a friendly partnership. I offered them an exclusive, immediate intellectual property buyout. I displayed the sanitized performance metrics of Aegis Data Solutions LLC. I showed them exactly how my software could automate their entire regulatory framework and eliminate their federal liability overnight. The chief executive officer recognized the lethal advantage immediately. I demanded $40 million for the absolute transfer of ownership, stipulating that the definitive agreement had to be signed and executed, with funds transferred to an impenetrable escrow account before the stock market opened on Monday. They agreed to my non-negotiable terms without a single counteroffer. By Sunday morning, the legal architecture of my retaliation was entirely locked in place. I shifted my focus from corporate warfare to domestic surveillance. I opened my personal banking application on my laptop. Jason thought he had effectively blinded me by draining our joint savings account, completely forgetting that I was still listed as the primary guarantor on his premium platinum credit cards. The digital portal provided a real-time synchronized feed of his weekend spending spree. I sat at the glass dining table, watching the transactions populate on the screen with chilling, clinical detachment. At 10:15 in the morning, a charge for $4,000 cleared at a luxury downtown boutique. He was buying designer clothes for his new fiancée. At 1:30 in the afternoon, a charge for $1,200 appeared from an exclusive French restaurant, the exact same bistro where he had previously refused to take me for our 5th wedding anniversary, because he claimed it was financially irresponsible. At 4 o'clock, a massive pending authorization flagged on the account for $25,000, processed by a high-end corporate leasing agency. He was securing the down payment for a luxury condominium, utilizing the premium credit line I had spent half a decade building to fund his new life. A younger, more naive version of myself would have shattered into a million pieces watching those numbers flash across the monitor. I would have called him screaming and crying, begging for a rational explanation. But the woman sitting in the hotel suite felt absolutely nothing. The grief had evaporated completely, replaced by a glacier of solid ice. I meticulously logged every single transaction into a secure spreadsheet. Each exorbitant charge was a highly documented instance of the dissipation of marital assets. Jason was actively racking up insurmountable debt on a card he fundamentally could not pay off once Andre's venture capital firm imploded. He was effectively wrapping a financial noose around his own neck, completely unaware that the floor was about to drop out from underneath him. Sunday night bled seamlessly into Monday morning. I did not sleep. I stood in the center of the dark hotel room, watching the city lights of Seattle reflect off the heavy storm clouds. The silence of the suite was absolute. I thought about Catherine and Olivia, clinking their expensive wine glasses at the steakhouse, reveling in my supposed defeat. I thought about Andre, arrogantly sliding that non-disclosure agreement across the mahogany table. I thought about Bradley mocking my age while sipping champagne in the boardroom. They had severely miscalculated my threshold for pain, and vastly underestimated my capacity for retaliation. I walked into the massive marble bathroom and turned on the shower. I washed away the exhaustion of the weekend and stepped out, drying off with a thick towel. I dressed with meticulous intention, selecting a tailored crimson blouse and a razor-sharp black pencil skirt. I pulled my hair back into a severe, flawless twist. I applied my makeup with the steady hands of a surgeon preparing for a complex operation. I looked in the mirror, verifying that the reflection staring back projected nothing but absolute, terrifying power. I walked back into the main living area and approached the kitchenette. I boiled water and brewed a cup of Earl Grey tea, letting the rich bergamot scent fill the room. I carried the delicate porcelain teacup over to the floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the financial district. Below me, the city was waking up. Thousands of corporate employees were rushing to their offices, grabbing coffee, fighting through the frantic morning commute. In the distance, I could barely make out the top floors of the Apex Financial skyscraper piercing through the low-hanging fog. I set my teacup down on the small glass side table and picked up my encrypted laptop. I rested the device on my knees, keeping my eyes fixed firmly on the screen. The terminal interface was glowing brightly in the dim morning light. The stark white numbers were actively counting down the final seconds of a perfectly orchestrated corporate execution. It is exactly 7:59 in the morning on Monday. I sit completely still by the hotel window, my hands resting lightly on the keyboard, my breathing perfectly regulated. I watch the clock tick down to 0. Across the city, towering high above the damp, bustling streets of the Seattle financial district, the 40th floor of the Apex Financial skyscraper was practically vibrating with nervous corporate energy. It was exactly 8 o'clock on a Monday morning. The atmosphere inside the main executive boardroom was suffocatingly tense, heavy with the scent of freshly brewed artisanal coffee and the sharp, undeniable odor of executive panic. Today was the official Securities and Exchange Commission pre-initial public offering audit. This was the final insurmountable hurdle before Apex could launch their stock to the public market and secure hundreds of millions of dollars in institutional investment. Bradley Pierce stood near the head of the massive, polished mahogany conference table. Despite the aggressive climate control pumping cool air into the room, a highly visible bead of sweat rolled slowly down his temple, disappearing into the stiff collar of his custom-tailored suit. He wiped his clammy palms against his slacks, desperately attempting to project the image of a fearless corporate leader. He flashed a brilliant, practiced smile at the three federal agents sitting rigidly on the opposite side of the table. The lead auditor, a stern, unsmiling woman with sharp eyes and a pristine gray blazer, tapped her pen rhythmically against her leather portfolio, waiting for the proceedings to commence. Sitting directly across from the federal agents, completely at ease in an oversized leather executive chair, was my brother-in-law, Andre. Unlike Bradley, Andre looked entirely in his element. He wore his bespoke navy suit like a suit of armor, exuding the absolute predatory confidence of a venture capitalist who believed he held the entire world in the palm of his hand. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, weaving a masterful tapestry of financial jargon and corporate buzzwords designed to pacify the federal regulators. "We have recently streamlined our entire data infrastructure," Andre explained smoothly, his deep, authoritative voice filling the room. "My venture capital firm prides itself on absolute regulatory perfection. When we acquired our controlling stake in Apex last week, we implemented a massive modernization initiative across the compliance department. We brought in fresh, highly capable talent to ensure your audit today is completely flawless. You will find that our predictive software exceeds every single federal mandate currently on the books." The lead federal agent stopped tapping her pen. "We certainly hope so," she replied, her tone completely devoid of warmth. "We are ready to review the live master compliance reports. Please project the primary data architecture onto the main monitor." Bradley swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing visibly against his silk tie. He turned his attention to the glass walls of the boardroom. Sitting just outside, directly in my old ergonomic chair at my former desk, was Gwen. The 25-year-old replacement looked drastically different from the smug, champagne-sipping girl who had celebrated my termination just 3 days prior. Her posture was completely rigid. Her eyes were darting nervously across the dual monitors, and her complexion was the color of chalk. She looked exactly like a deer caught in the headlights of an oncoming freight train. Bradley stepped up to the glass partition, his smile tightening into a hostile, warning grimace. He knocked sharply on the glass twice to get her attention, then opened the heavy door just enough to bark his command. "Gwen," he ordered, his voice laced with aggressive urgency. "The auditors are waiting. Pull up the master compliance reports and mirror your terminal to the primary boardroom display. Now!" Gwen flinched violently at the sound of his voice. She nodded frantically, her blonde hair falling into her eyes as she leaned closer to the keyboard. She had spent the entire weekend ignoring the complex technical manuals I had left behind, assuming the system ran on autopilot. She fully believed that holding the title of director automatically granted her the competence to execute the job. Now, with the entire corporate future of Apex Financial resting squarely on her shoulders, the illusion of her unearned authority was instantly shattering. Inside the boardroom, the massive 80-inch high-definition monitor on the far wall hummed to life. The screen displayed Gwen's desktop feed in real time for the federal agents Andre and Bradley to watch. The room fell into absolute silence. The only sound was the rapid, frantic clicking of Gwen's keyboard echoing through the open glass door. Andre leaned back in his chair, taking a slow, confident sip of his iced water. He shot Bradley a knowing, victorious look, completely convinced that their brilliant strategy of placing a federal auditor's daughter in the director chair was about to pay off with a massive billion-dollar public offering. He was already calculating his unprecedented profit margins. Outside the boardroom, Gwen's hands hovered over the keyboard. She opened the primary compliance terminal, the exact gateway to the algorithm I had designed, coded and legally secured under my own private corporation. She pulled out a small sticky note where she had hastily scribbled the administrative login credentials Bradley had provided her on Friday afternoon. She carefully typed in the username. She meticulously inputted the complex password string. She took a deep, shaky breath, closed her eyes for a fraction of a second, and hit the enter key. For exactly 2 seconds, nothing happened. The loading icon spun lazily in the center of the massive boardroom monitor. Bradley exhaled a long, audible breath of relief, stepping back from the glass door to retake his position at the head of the mahogany table. He began to unbutton his suit jacket, preparing to guide the federal agents through the pristine dataset. Then, the entire system reacted. It did not just fail to load. It retaliated. A high-pitched, jarring electronic error tone erupted from the boardroom speakers, instantly shattering the quiet professional atmosphere. The massive 80-inch monitor went completely pitch black. The sudden darkness swallowed the room for one terrifying heartbeat before the screen flashed violently, a rapid strobing effect that made the federal agents physically recoil in their leather chairs. Bradley froze his hand, still resting on the button of his suit jacket. The blood drained from his face as his eyes widened in sheer terror. Andre dropped his water glass, the ice clattering loudly against the wood table, his arrogant posture instantly collapsing into profound confusion. The strobing stopped, replaced instantly by a glaring, blood-red background that illuminated the faces of every single person in the room with a harsh, crimson glow. In the very center of the screen, massive, bold white letters burned into the display. The message was inescapable. It was a digital guillotine dropping directly onto their corporate empire. Access denied. Unlimited software. IP revoked. The silence inside the executive boardroom shattered into a million jagged pieces. For one suspended second, nobody drew a single breath. The glaring red light from the massive monitor bathed the room in a hellish crimson glow, reflecting off the polished mahogany table and illuminating the terrified faces of the corporate executives. Then, absolute and unmitigated pandemonium erupted. The lead Securities and Exchange Commission auditor slammed her leather portfolio shut. The sound echoed through the room like a gunshot. She stood up immediately, pushing her heavy leather chair back with aggressive force. The two federal agents beside her followed suit, their previously neutral expressions hardening into masks of deep professional hostility. They did not view the red error screen as a simple technical glitch. In their line of work, a sudden catastrophic data failure occurring at the exact moment of a highly anticipated pre-initial public offering audit meant only one thing. It meant an active, deliberate cover-up of massive financial crimes. "What kind of game are you playing here, Mr. Pierce?" the lead auditor demanded, her voice cutting through the rising panic like a serrated blade. "We are conducting a federal investigation into your operational compliance. Withholding data is a severe federal offense. I am placing an immediate hold on your public offering paperwork until this is resolved." Bradley lost his polished corporate veneer in a fraction of a second. The sweat that had been beading on his forehead now poured down his face, completely ruining his expensive, custom-tailored appearance. He scrambled backward, his polished dress shoes slipping slightly on the premium carpet. He ignored the federal agents entirely and lunged toward the glass partition separating the boardroom from the main office floor. He threw open the heavy frosted glass door and practically leapt at Gwen. Gwen sat paralyzed in my former ergonomic chair. Her hands were shaking so violently that her manicured fingernails were rattling audibly against the plastic keys of the keyboard. She tried to push herself away from the desk, her eyes wide with sheer, unadulterated terror.
"What did you do?"
Bradley screamed, his voice cracking with panic. His shouting echoed across the entire open-plan office, causing dozens of employees to stop working and stare in absolute shock. "What did you just delete, Gwen?" I gave you the administrative credentials. You were supposed to project the compliance logs, not wipe the entire server. I did not delete anything, Gwen stammered, her voice pitching into a high, hysterical register. I just typed exactly what you gave me. I hit enter, and the screen just turned red. I do not know how this system works. She was hyperventilating, completely unequipped to handle the immense pressure of a federal audit. She had accepted the director title, assuming it would consist of long lunches, impressive business cards, and delegating actual work to subordinates. She never anticipated standing on the precipice of a federal investigation. Inside the boardroom, Andre stood up. His massive frame cast a long shadow across the mahogany table. He attempted to deploy his signature venture capitalist charm, raising his hands in a placating gesture toward the furious federal agents. "Let us all remain perfectly calm," Andre said, projecting a false, deep authority. "This is clearly just a minor technical malfunction. We will have our technology department reboot the servers and provide you with the raw data momentarily." The lead auditor glared at Andre with absolute disdain. "You have exactly 10 minutes to produce the unencrypted compliance logs," she stated coldly. "Otherwise, my team is walking out of this building and I am calling the regional director to launch a full-scale investigation into Apex Financial." Before Andre could formulate another empty corporate promise, the heavy glass doors to the boardroom burst open. The director of information technology sprinted into the room. He was pale, completely out of breath, and his tie was thrown haphazardly over his shoulder. He carried a diagnostic laptop clutched tightly to his chest. He completely ignored the furious federal agents and the shouting match happening out on the floor. He locked eyes with Bradley, and his expression conveyed absolute, catastrophic dread. "The system is not deleted," Bradley, the IT director, announced, his voice shaking as he set the laptop down on the polished wood table. "I just ran a full diagnostic trace on the core server architecture. We did not lose the files. We never actually had them." Bradley stopped screaming at Gwen and marched back into the boardroom. "What are you talking about?" he snarled, grabbing the edge of the table. "I saw the compliance algorithm running flawlessly on Friday afternoon." "It was running on our network, but it was never hosted on our internal servers," the IT director explained, turning his laptop screen to face Bradley and Andre. "The entire predictive compliance engine, the architecture keeping us completely clear of federal violations, belongs to an external corporate entity called Aegis Data Solutions LLC. We were merely operating on a conditional licensing agreement, and that connection has just been forcefully severed from the outside." Andre stepped forward, his perfectly tailored suit wrinkling as he leaned heavily over the diagnostic screen. "Who owns Aegis Data Solutions?" Andre demanded, his voice dropping to a dangerous, lethal cadence. "Who holds the administrative keys to that license?" The IT director swallowed hard, taking a slow step away from the furious venture capitalist. "Claire does," he revealed the truth, dropping into the room like a live grenade. "She is the sole founder and legal owner of the LLC. I just checked the vendor contract. The licensing agreement contained a heavily encrypted termination clause. The exact second you deactivated Claire's employee badge this morning, the system registered a breach of contract and permanently revoked our access. She took the entire security infrastructure with her." The realization hit Bradley with the force of a speeding train. He had literally fired the only person who owned the shield protecting his fraudulent company from federal prison. He had arrogantly marched her out of the building, completely unaware that she was carrying the keys to his entire corporate empire in her pocket. Suddenly, the quiet atmosphere of the boardroom was pierced by a rapid, aggressive vibration. Andre's phone started blowing up. He pulled the sleek device from his jacket pocket. A barrage of high-priority alerts flooded his screen from his venture capital firm. The sophisticated risk management software monitoring his portfolio was detecting massive, unprecedented market instability regarding their Apex holdings. The rumors were already starting to hemorrhage into the financial sector. Andre's facade of absolute predatory control completely shattered. His $100 million investment was actively burning to the ground in real time. Bradley, consumed by the sheer terror of impending federal indictment, desperately needed a scapegoat. He spun around and marched directly back out to the floor. He grabbed Gwen aggressively by the upper arm, hauling the terrified young woman out of my old ergonomic chair. He leaned in close, snarling directly into her face with a mixture of rage and absolute desperation. "You fix this right now," Bradley ordered, his voice echoing loudly off the glass walls. "I do not care how you do it. You figure out a way to get those servers back online, or you are going to federal prison for corporate data destruction." Gwen yanked her arm away from his aggressive grip. She was sobbing uncontrollably now, tears ruining her expensive makeup and streaming down her pale face. Her chest heaved in absolute panic as she looked at the circle of staring employees and the furious federal agents packing their briefcases. Without a single word, she turned and sprinted down the long glass-walled corridor, pushing frantically past the bewildered staff. She burst into the executive women's restroom, slamming the heavy wooden door shut behind her. She locked herself inside the furthest stall, her hands shaking violently as she pulled out her phone, desperately searching for the only person who could save her. Inside my quiet, climate-controlled hotel suite, my phone began to vibrate violently against the glass dining table. I lowered my teacup, watching the screen illuminate the dim room. The caller identification displayed Gwen. The frantic buzzing stopped for a fraction of a second before immediately starting again. She was panic calling. I sat perfectly still, listening to the harsh mechanical hum of the device as it vibrated relentlessly across the smooth glass surface. I let it ring. I watched the missed call notifications stack up on my locked screen. 5 missed calls. 10 missed calls. 15. The sheer, raw desperation radiating through the cellular signal was palpable. She was likely hiding somewhere in the Apex Financial Building, completely isolated, realizing that her prestigious new director title was actually a death sentence. 20 missed calls. 25 missed calls. I took another slow, highly deliberate sip of my Earl Grey tea. On the 26th call, I reached out and tapped the green accept button. I brought the phone slowly to my ear, remaining absolutely silent. "Claire, please, you have to help me," Gwen screamed into the receiver. Her voice was completely ragged, heavily choked with deep, hysterical sobs. "I am locked in the executive restroom. The system completely crashed. The federal agents are shutting down the audit. Bradley is threatening to send me to prison if I do not fix the network. You have to give me the administrative password. Please, Claire. I am begging you." I listened to her hyperventilating, the sound of her frantic breathing echoing over the line. When I finally spoke, my voice was completely devoid of emotion, a sharp contrast to her absolute panic. I employed the precise, sterile cadence of a corporate litigator delivering a final verdict. "Gwen, you are currently an unauthorized user attempting to gain administrative access to a proprietary network," I stated smoothly. As the sole legal proprietor of Aegis Data Solutions, LLC, I must officially inform you that any continued attempts to bypass the security encryption on my software constitute a direct violation of the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. You are actively engaging in federal corporate espionage. Gwen choked on a sob, clearly struggling to comprehend the dense legal terminology I was hitting her with. "What are you talking about?" she cried, her voice echoing off the bathroom tiles. "I just need the password for the Apex servers. Bradley said you locked us out." I took a very slow, measured breath, preparing to deliver the final crushing blow that would completely shatter her reality. "You did not replace me, Gwen," I said, my voice dropping to a terrifying whisper. "You were hired to be the scapegoat for when the SEC realized Bradley was cooking the books. You just tried to hack into my private IP. I have already officially notified the FBI of the cyber intrusion." The line went completely dead as the phone slipped from her trembling, sweating hands and crashed heavily onto the cold bathroom floor. I placed my phone back onto the smooth glass surface of the dining table and waited. The quiet ambiance of the hotel suite remained entirely undisturbed, a stark contrast to the absolute devastation I had just unleashed across the city. I reached over to my laptop and launched a secondary, highly encrypted audio recording application, routing the input directly through my cellular connection. I knew exactly how corporate cowards operated when their carefully constructed facades began to shatter. Bradley Pierce was a man who led exclusively by intimidation, relying on his booming voice, his expensive custom suits, and his unearned authority to bully his subordinates into submission. But without my compliance shield protecting him, facing down a team of furious federal agents who held the power to freeze his bank accounts and revoke his freedom, his intimidation tactics were absolutely useless. Exactly 2 minutes after Gwen dropped her device onto the bathroom floor, my phone vibrated violently against the glass. The screen illuminated with Bradley's contact information. I tapped the record button on my laptop monitor, verifying the green audio waveform was actively capturing sound, and then I calmly accepted the call. I put him on speakerphone, leaning back into the plush velvet of my armchair. "Claire, listen to me very carefully," Bradley barked, his voice laced with a heavy, artificial authority. He was desperately attempting to project total control, but his rapid, shallow breathing betrayed his underlying terror. "I do not have time for these petty, vindictive games. You are going to log in to the administrative portal right now and turn the servers back on. If you restore the compliance network before the federal agents walk out of the lobby, I might consider not filing a civil lawsuit against you for corporate sabotage." I did not say a single word. I sat perfectly still, listening to the chaotic background noise filtering through his microphone. I could hear the distinct, muffled sounds of panicked executives shouting in the hallways of Apex Financial. I could even hear the lead auditor demanding the immediate production of the unencrypted data logs. I let the silence stretch across the cellular connection. It was a classic negotiation tactic. Absolute silence forces the desperate party to fill the void, often causing them to reveal their deepest vulnerabilities. "Claire, did you hear me?" Bradley demanded, his volume increasing sharply as his authority began to fracture. "Turn the software back on. You signed a vendor agreement. You have a legal obligation to provide service to this company." Still, I offered absolutely nothing but the quiet, steady rhythm of my own breathing. I could practically see him pacing the floor of his corner office, tugging nervously at his expensive silk tie, staring out at the Seattle skyline as his entire professional world collapsed around his perfectly polished shoes. He had spent 3 years claiming my brilliant work as his own, accepting bonuses and accolades for a system he fundamentally did not understand. Now, the true architect had abandoned the building, and the structural integrity of his entire career was crumbling into dust. 10 more seconds of agonizing silence passed. The heavy, oppressive quiet began to crush his manufactured arrogance completely. The transition was immediate and entirely pathetic. The booming, commanding executive voice vanished, replaced by a high, strained pitch of raw, unadulterated desperation. Okay, Claire, let us be reasonable here," Bradley stammered, the hostility bleeding completely out of his tone, leaving behind only sheer panic. "Look, I understand you are upset about the termination. Emotions are running high today. We can fix this. I can fix this. Just give me the decryption key for the database, and I will reinstate your employment immediately. We will call the termination a clerical error. I will double your base salary. I will authorize a massive retention bonus. Whatever number you want, just name it. Please, Claire. The Securities and Exchange Commission agents are literally packing their briefcases. They are threatening to halt the public offering and launch a federal probe." I finally leaned forward, resting my elbows on the cool glass table. My voice was perfectly calibrated, smooth, analytical, and entirely lethal. You cannot reinstate an employment contract that you breached with malicious intent, Bradley, I stated calmly. And you certainly cannot afford my intellectual property. Zenith Financial just purchased the exclusive permanent rights to the Aegis Data Solutions algorithm for $40 million. The transfer cleared escrow 30 minutes ago. A harsh, gasping sound erupted from the speaker. It sounded like a man physically choking on his own breath. You sold it, to Zenith, Bradley wheezed in absolute horror. You cannot do that. We need that system. You fired the only vendor authorized to operate the system, I reminded him clinically. I am simply curious about one thing, Bradley. You knew exactly how deeply the company relied on my software to pass federal inspections. You knew the public offering depended entirely on my pristine compliance records. So why did you authorize a hostile termination without cause, just days before the most critical audit in company history? You are incredibly arrogant, but you have never been suicidal. I was intentionally leading him down a very specific, carefully constructed verbal corridor. I needed him to panic. I needed him to feel completely cornered by the impending federal investigation, so his survival instincts would override his legal common sense. It was not my idea, Bradley shouted, his voice cracking wildly. He was entirely unspooling now, desperate to shift the blame away from his own catastrophic failure. I did not want to fire you, but you signed the termination paperwork, I pressed, applying continuous rhythmic psychological pressure. You stood in the hallway and mocked my age. You popped champagne with a severely underqualified replacement while security marched me out into the rain. That sounds exactly like a man completely in charge of his own corporate decisions. No, Bradley, screamed the sheer terror of a federal indictment finally shattering his remaining self-control. I only fired you because Andre forced me to do it. I kept my eyes locked on the audio waveform recording on my laptop screen. The green peaks and valleys were capturing his confession in perfect, high-definition clarity. I pushed him one final time, demanding the exact admission required to guarantee a federal prosecution. Why would a venture capitalist care about the director of data compliance? I asked, feigning genuine confusion. Because you would not approve the altered financial reports, Bradley shrieked, totally abandoning every single non-disclosure agreement he had ever signed. Andre said you were too rigid. He told me that if we wanted to inflate the company valuation for the public offering, we had to get you out of the building and put his own puppet in the director chair. He threatened to pull his $100 million investment if I did not fire you. I only fired you because Andre forced me to so we could rig the IPO. I will give you whatever you want. Just please, Claire, turn the system back on. I watched the recording software capture the final syllable of his desperate, screaming confession. I reached out and tapped the save icon, locking the audio file securely into my encrypted hard drive. I sat back in my chair, feeling a profound, absolute sense of victory wash over my entire body. The entire corporate conspiracy, the coordinated termination, the illegal market manipulation, it was all perfectly documented, straight from the mouth of the vice president. Thank you, Bradley, I said, my voice dropping to a whisper of pure, unadulterated ice. The SEC will love this recording. I pressed the end call button. Click. The call disconnected with a sharp digital click, plunging my hotel suite back into absolute, impenetrable silence. I did not move for several minutes. I simply watched the audio file process on my laptop, the progress bar filling with a bright green confirmation. The moment the file encrypted, I forwarded it directly to Harrison via our secure portal. I attached a single sentence detailing my exact instructions to send the recording immediately to the federal agents currently waiting in the Apex lobby. Then I opened a new tab on my browser and logged into my premium financial news terminal. I wanted a front row seat to the exact moment the corporate execution went public. I did not have to wait long. Less than 45 minutes after I severed the connection to the Aegis Data Solutions servers, the financial world violently erupted. The breaking news alert flashed across my screen in glaring crimson letters, interrupting the standard morning market analysis. The Bloomberg headline was brutally concise and entirely devastating. Apex Financial IPO halted, SEC investigating massive IP fraud. The article beneath the headline was updating in real time, detailing how federal agents had completely locked down the 40th floor of the Apex skyscraper. They were actively seizing hard drives, confiscating executive communications, and halting all trading activities related to the impending public offering. The financial analysts on the live broadcast were visibly stunned, reporting that a critical software license had been illegally claimed as corporate property, completely voiding the entire valuation of the company in a matter of minutes. The blast radius of the scandal did not just obliterate Apex Financial. It instantly sought out the massive influx of capital that had been artificially inflating their books. Within a matter of 60 minutes, the catastrophic news hit the portfolio of the venture capital firm responsible for backing the fraudulent public offering. I pulled up the live stock ticker for Andre's massive investment conglomerate. The graph looked like a sheer cliff face. Institutional investors were panic selling at a completely unprecedented volume, terrified of being tied to a federal fraud investigation. The line plummeted downward in a sharp, devastating trajectory. 10%, 20%. By the time I took another sip of my cooling Earl Grey tea, the stock had plummeted a staggering 40% in just under 2 hours. Billions of dollars in market capitalization were simply vanishing into thin air. My encrypted phone vibrated against the glass table. The caller identification displayed a private, unlisted number, but I knew exactly who was on the other end of the line. The arrogant, untouchable titan of the Seattle tech sector was officially bleeding out, and he was desperately looking for a tourniquet. I tapped the accept button and brought the device to my ear.
Claire, turn the software back on right now.
Andre roared into the receiver. His voice was completely unrecognizable. The smooth, booming baritone that had echoed off the mahogany walls of the steakhouse was entirely gone. He sounded like a cornered, terrified animal. He was panting heavily, his breaths ragged and frantic, the sound of pure, unadulterated executive terror broadcasting directly into my ear. "You have no idea what you just did. You just wiped out 40% of my firm's value. I am hemorrhaging millions of dollars every single minute. Turn it back on." I kept my voice perfectly modulated, projecting the serene, clinical detachment of a surgeon observing a fascinating but ultimately doomed specimen. "I did not do anything to your firm, Andre," I corrected him smoothly. "I merely protected my legal intellectual property from a hostile corporate takeover. The market is simply responding to the fact that your $100 million investment was built on a foundation of absolute fraud."
You malicious, vindictive fraud!
Andre screamed, completely losing whatever fragile grip he had left on his professional composure.
I will destroy you for this. I will deploy every single litigator on my payroll. I will sue you in federal court for corporate sabotage, intentional interference with business relations, and gross market manipulation. I will make sure you spend the rest of your miserable life buried under so much legal debt you will never see the light of day.
"I am going to ruin you." His threats were loud, violent, and entirely meaningless. He was attempting to use the sheer force of his anger to intimidate me back into submission, relying on the same aggressive tactics he had used to dominate boardrooms his entire career. But I was not a terrified junior analyst like Gwen, and I was certainly not a weak, compliant puppet like his wife Olivia. "You cannot sue a vendor for executing a legally binding termination clause, Andre," I replied, my tone dropping to a whisper of absolute ice. "You orchestrated my firing to remove a compliance obstacle. You manipulated Bradley into breaching my contract. You handed me the exact legal mechanism I needed to sever the connection.
I am not the architect of your destruction. I am merely the mirror reflecting your own catastrophic incompetence back at you.
There was a frantic shuffling sound on the other end of the line. I could hear other executives in his office screaming about margin calls and frozen assets. Andre was physically struggling to breathe, the crushing weight of his monumental failure suffocating his arrogance. "We can negotiate this," Andre begged, pivoting from aggressive threats to desperate pleading in a matter of seconds. "Name your price, Claire. I will wire the funds directly to whatever offshore account you want. Just tell the federal agents this was a technical misunderstanding, please." I reached across the glass table and picked up the crisp white document he had casually slid toward me at the steakhouse. It was the non-disclosure agreement he had tried to force me to sign. The legal trap designed to buy my silence for pennies on the dollar, while he and Jason divided my life savings. I am currently looking at paragraph 7, section C of the non-disclosure agreement you so graciously offered me at dinner, I stated, holding the paper up to the natural light filtering through the hotel window. It explicitly states that the undersigned, being me, fully acknowledges that the venture capital firm holds no legal liability for any financial losses incurred through sudden market fluctuations or unauthorized software deployments. You wrote a clause to protect yourself from my retaliation, but the legal phrasing actually completely indemnifies me from your current losses. You legally absolved me of any responsibility for this exact scenario. Andre choked on his own breath. He realized the fatal flaw in his own legal strategy. He had handed me a loaded gun, assuming I was too stupid to find the safety switch. "You bet $100 million on a stolen horse, Andre," I said, delivering the final lethal blow with absolute precision. "Your board is voting to oust you as we speak." The skyline outside my hotel window shifted from the stark gray of a Seattle afternoon to the deep, glittering black of evening. I sat in the velvet armchair of my executive suite, the warm glow of the city illuminating the room. The financial news was still playing on mute on the television, displaying endless repetitive loops of federal agents carrying heavy boxes out of the Apex financial lobby. It was an absolute masterpiece of corporate destruction, and I had orchestrated every single frame of the collapse. The satisfying quiet of the room was suddenly shattered by a violent, frantic pounding at my heavy oak door. It was not the polite, measured knock of hotel room service. It was desperate, erratic, and aggressively loud. I stood up, smoothing the front of my tailored skirt, and walked deliberately across the plush carpet. I checked the digital security monitor mounted on the wall near the entryway. Standing in the brightly lit hallway, looking exactly like a man who had just survived a catastrophic shipwreck, was Jason. The flawless, arrogant executive who had swaggered down my staircase that morning was completely gone. His expensive charcoal suit jacket was severely wrinkled and heavily spotted with rain. His designer tie was pulled loose, hanging haphazardly around his unbuttoned collar. His perfectly styled hair was a disheveled, matted mess. In his trembling right hand, he clutched a pathetic, crushed bouquet of cheap red roses, the exact kind of wilted flowers you buy as a desperate afterthought from a gas station checkout counter. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open just enough to look at him. He practically collapsed against the wooden doorframe, his chest heaving as if he had sprinted all the way up the 42 flights of stairs, Claire. He gasped, his voice thick with panic and exhaustion. "Thank God you are here. Please, you have to let me in." I took a single step back, allowing him to stumble into the marble foyer. He dropped the ruined bouquet onto the floor, completely ignoring the crushed petals scattering across the pristine tile. He looked frantically around the luxurious suite, taking in the undeniable evidence of my absolute financial independence before locking his desperate, bloodshot eyes back onto mine. "Everything is gone, Claire," Jason stammered, pacing erratically near the glass dining table. "The whole firm is burning to the ground." The exact moment the news hit Bloomberg about the compliance fraud the board of directors initiated, a massive corporate purge, Andre completely lost his mind. He started firing everyone associated with the Apex account to save his own skin, including me. I was terminated, effectively immediately. I maintained my absolute silence, letting him unravel his own miserable narrative. And the money? Jason continued, his voice pitching higher in sheer, unadulterated terror. The federal agents flagged the massive transfer I made this morning as part of an active insider trading investigation. They froze the offshore account. They froze my personal checking account. They froze every single one of my credit cards. I tried to buy a coffee an hour ago, and the card was declined for suspected federal wire fraud. He stopped pacing and looked at me, a pathetic, broken shell of a man. His hands were shaking so violently he had to stuff them deeply into his pockets to hide the tremors. And my fiancée. He whispered the word, sounding utterly ridiculous in the quiet room. She left me the exact second the leasing agent called to tell us the deposit for the luxury condominium bounced. She grabbed her designer bags and walked right out the door. She told me she refused to be tied to a man under active federal investigation. She blocked my phone number. I have absolutely nothing, Claire. Jason suddenly dropped to his knees. The sharp thud of his kneecaps hitting the hardwood floorboards was the most profoundly satisfying sound I had heard all evening. He looked up at me, thick tears streaming down his face, completely abandoning the ruthless, calculating persona he had worn so proudly at the steakhouse. Claire, you have to believe me, he pleaded, his voice cracking into pathetic, ragged sobs. I was totally brainwashed. Andre got into my head. He promised me a fortune, guaranteed me that firing you was just standard corporate restructuring. He manipulated me into draining the joint accounts. I never actually wanted to hurt you. I was just terrified of losing my investments. We are a team. We have always been a team. He reached into his wrinkled suit jacket and pulled out the thick manila folder he had aggressively slammed onto our kitchen counter that morning. It was significantly crumpled, now heavily stained with rain and sweat. He held it up to me like a desperate offering. We can rip these up right now, Jason cried, tears dripping from his chin directly onto his expensive silk shirt. We can throw the divorce papers in the trash. We can start over today. I will do whatever you want. I will go to counseling. I will be the supportive husband you deserve. Just please, Claire, you have to help me fix this. You have to tell the federal agents that the money transfer was a simple marital mistake. I did not reach for the folder. I did not offer a single word of comfort. I simply stood over him, my posture perfectly rigid, my face a mask of absolute clinical detachment. I looked at the digital clock on my laptop screen resting on the table. It was exactly 8:15 in the evening. I decided to let him sit there on the floor and cry. I timed it. I let the heavy, suffocating silence stretch for 1 full minute. Jason continued to sob, his worthless apologies echoing uselessly in the luxurious suite. I watched his desperation curdle into deep, agonizing shame as he realized his theatrical tears were having absolutely zero effect on my emotional state. I let another full minute pass. 60 more seconds of watching the man who had mocked my career, belittled my dedication, and allied with my toxic family squirm on the floor in absolute agony. He had attempted to leave me completely destitute, laughing directly in my face, while his mistress honked her horn in my driveway. Now he was begging for my mercy, because his own rampant greed had trapped him in a federal snare. When the clock shifted to 8:17, I finally moved. I walked slowly around his kneeling, pathetic form and approached the glass dining table. I reached into my leather briefcase and retrieved a crisp, pristine document. It was a highly magnified, notarized copy of the very contract he had used to justify his theft that morning. I walked back and stood directly in front of him, looking down at his tear-stained face. You spent an absolute fortune on legal fees to ensure this contract was completely impenetrable, I stated, my voice dropping to a smooth, terrifying whisper. But you were so focused on protecting your own bank accounts that you completely failed to read the fine print. I held the document up, forcing him to look at the highlighted text. You forgot one tiny detail about our prenup, Jason. I watched his eyes widen in absolute horror as his analytical brain finally processed the catastrophic math. He had actively conspired with my toxic family, drained my bank accounts, and aligned himself with corporate criminals, all to secure a minor financial victory. He had willingly sacrificed a life of unimaginable luxury because he was too arrogant and too eager to see me fail. I tossed the highlighted prenuptial contract onto the glass table and reached back into my leather briefcase. My movements were slow, precise, and entirely unbothered by his frantic sobbing. I retrieved a second stack of papers, these printed on heavy, cream-colored legal stock. The gold-embossed seal of the state of Washington gleamed perfectly in the warm hotel lighting. I held the heavy packet out toward him. Jason stared at the documents, his red, swollen eyes blinking rapidly in profound confusion. His trembling fingers hesitated, but he slowly reached up and took the papers from my hand. He looked down at the first page, completely unable to comprehend what he was holding. Read the name of the corporation at the very top of the page, I commanded. My voice sharp and unyielding. Jason swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing erratically. Aegis Data Solutions, LLC, he whispered, his voice cracking on the unfamiliar corporate title. What is this, Claire? I do not understand. Why are you showing me some random corporate filing? It is not a random corporate filing, I corrected, smoothly stepping back and folding my arms across my chest. That is the official Articles of Incorporation for a private cybersecurity firm I quietly established 3 years ago. I am listed as the sole founder, the sole proprietary owner, and the sole executive officer. Now, Jason, I want you to remember the aggressively specific legal boundaries you demanded we establish before our wedding. You were absolutely terrified that a potential divorce might entitle me to a portion of your future executive endeavors. So you hired an extremely expensive legal team to draft an impenetrable financial shield. I leaned forward, locking my eyes onto his horrified face. Do you remember the exact wording of Section 8, Paragraph D? Because I remember it perfectly. I memorized it. The clause explicitly dictates that any corporate entity, intellectual property, or business venture incorporated solely under the name of one individual spouse shall remain the absolute, unchallengeable, and completely separate property of that founder. In the event of a divorce, the other spouse entirely waives any and all legal rights to claim ownership equity or profit sharing from that entity. Jason stared at the pristine legal document in his hands, his breath coming in short, rapid gasps. He shook his head back and forth, desperately, trying to reject the terrible truth forming in his mind. I do not understand, he repeated, his voice barely a weak croak. What does this have to do with my bank accounts? It has everything to do with your absolute financial ruin, I stated clinically. Aegis Data Solutions is the company that legally owns the compliance algorithm running Apex Financial. I did not just work for Bradley. I owned the exact technology keeping his entire company out of federal prison. When he blindly fired me this morning, my software automatically initiated a catastrophic withdrawal from their servers. That is why Andre is screaming at you. That is why your venture capital firm is burning to the ground. And more importantly, Jason, that software is currently sitting securely in my private possession. I paused, letting the heavy, suffocating silence of the luxury suite wrap around him like a physical vice. He was still kneeling on the hardwood floor, staring up at me with sheer, unadulterated terror. This afternoon, I continued speaking with the cold, rhythmic cadence of a ticking clock. I finalized a massive intellectual property transfer. Zenith Financial, the largest competitor in our sector, eagerly purchased the absolute exclusive rights to the Aegis compliance algorithm. The executive board approved my non-negotiable terms immediately. The corporate wire transfer officially cleared escrow just over 3 hours ago. They paid exactly $40 million for the software. The color instantly vanished from Jason's handsome face. His tan complexion turned a sickening ashen gray. His jaw dropped open, but absolutely no sound came out. The heavy gold-embossed incorporation papers slipped completely through his trembling fingers, scattering across the polished floorboards like dead leaves. $40 million. I repeated, ensuring the massive figure resonated loudly against the walls of the suite. And because you forced me to sign an ironclad prenuptial agreement specifically designed to protect individual business ventures, you possess absolutely zero legal right to a single penny of that fortune. Your aggressive greed legally locked you out of an incredible windfall. You threw away your half of a $40 million empire just to protect your pathetic, measly $120,000 in joint savings. The devastating realization struck him with the brutal force of a physical execution. I watched his eyes widen in absolute horror as his analytical brain finally processed the catastrophic math. He had actively conspired with my toxic family, drained my bank accounts, and aligned himself with corporate criminals, all to secure a minor financial victory. He had willingly sacrificed a life of unimaginable luxury because he was too arrogant and too eager to see me fail. Jason lunged forward, grabbing desperately at the hem of my tailored black skirt. "Claire, please!" he wailed, burying his face into his hands as deep guttural sobs ripped through his chest. "You cannot do this. We are husband and wife. I made a terrible mistake. I was stupid. I will give the money back. I will transfer the $120,000 back to you right now. We can share the $40 million. We can move away. We can start over. Please, Claire, do not leave me with nothing." I looked down at the man sobbing hysterically at my feet. I felt absolutely no pity, no lingering affection, and no remorse. The emotional labor I had exhausted attempting to maintain our marriage was entirely gone, replaced by a permanent, impenetrable glacier. I stepped backward forcefully, pulling the fabric of my skirt out of his desperate, sweaty grip. I walked calmly across the plush carpet toward the heavy mahogany desk resting against the far wall of the executive suite. I picked up the sleek black hotel telephone. I pressed the single illuminated button designated for the front desk. The line connected immediately. "Yes, this is the guest in the executive corner suite on the 42nd floor," I said smoothly, my voice projecting polite, mild annoyance. "There is an unauthorized trespasser currently refusing to leave my room. I need him removed from the premises immediately." I placed the receiver back onto the cradle with a soft, definitive click. Jason stared at me, his mouth hanging open in absolute shock. He scrambled to his feet, slipping awkwardly against the scattered legal documents on the floor. "Claire, you cannot call security on your own husband," he shrieked, backing toward the entryway as if hoping to somehow rewrite the last 10 minutes of his miserable existence. Less than 90 seconds later, 3 large muscular security guards in dark suits appeared in the open doorway. They did not hesitate or ask for an explanation. They stepped into the suite, grabbing Jason firmly by the arms. He thrashed and kicked, screaming my name over and over again. The guards hauled him out of the room, dragging his sobbing, struggling body forcefully down the long, brightly lit hotel hallway. I slept that night with a profound, dreamless clarity. When the sun rose over the Seattle skyline the following morning, I was already dressed in a dark, inconspicuous trench coat, pulling my rental car into the cracked asphalt lot of a rundown diner on the industrial outskirts of the city. It was the exact kind of greasy, unpolished establishment where venture capitalists and corporate executives would never dream of stepping foot. I walked through the smudged glass doors and immediately spotted Gwen sitting in a peeling vinyl booth at the very back. The 25-year-old looked absolutely shattered. She was wearing an oversized gray hoodie, her blonde hair pulled into a messy, frantic knot. The arrogant, champagne-sipping girl from the glass-walled boardroom was entirely erased. In her place sat a terrified, trembling woman nursing a mug of cold black coffee. Her eyes were bloodshot and ringed with heavy dark circles, proving she had not slept a single minute since the red access denied screen illuminated the Apex Financial office. I slid into the booth directly across from her. I did not order anything. I just stared at her, letting the harsh fluorescent lights of the diner highlight her profound panic. "They are going to destroy me," Claire Gwen whispered, her voice completely hoarse. She kept looking over her shoulder, paranoid that federal agents were watching from the parking lot. Bradley spent the entire night locked in his office with the corporate defense lawyers. "They are drafting affidavits right now, claiming I was a rogue employee who intentionally sabotaged the compliance network. They are setting me up to take the fall for the entire intellectual property violation." I kept my expression entirely neutral. "You were hired exclusively to be their scapegoat, Gwen. I told you that over the phone. Andre needed your father at the Securities and Exchange Commission to look the other way during the public offering audit. But when the system crashed and the federal agents realized the compliance data was missing, your father could not protect you. The fraud is far too massive. You are facing 20 years in federal prison for market manipulation." A single tear slipped down Gwen's pale cheek, dropping silently into her cold coffee. I know she choked out, her hands shaking, as she reached into the front pocket of her hoodie. I heard Bradley screaming at Andre on a private conference call. I heard them discussing how to alter the internal communication logs to make it look like I acted entirely alone. But they underestimated me. I might not know how to run your compliance algorithm, Claire, but I know exactly how to pull an unencrypted server backup before they wipe the hard drives. Gwen pulled her hand out of her pocket and placed a small silver flash drive onto the sticky Formica table. She slid it cautiously across the surface until it rested directly in front of my hands. "That drive contains everything Gwen stated, her voice dropping to a desperate whisper. It has 3 years of encrypted internal emails between Bradley and Andre. It contains the shadow ledgers, the inflated valuation reports, and the direct digital communications proving they actively conspired to rig the initial public offering. It proves they intentionally fired you to bypass federal regulations. It is the absolute smoking gun. I brought it to you because you are the only person who can actually use it against them." I looked down at the silver flash drive. It was a tiny piece of metal, but it contained the absolute, unchallengeable power to send my former boss and my toxic brother-in-law to a federal penitentiary. It was the final lethal bullet I needed for my corporate execution. I reached out and closed my hand securely around the flash drive, slipping it safely into the pocket of my trench coat. I looked back at Gwen, observing the raw, unfiltered terror radiating from her exhausted frame. "You did the right thing, Gwen," I said, my tone completely calm and authoritative. "Now buy a ticket out of state and do not answer your phone tomorrow." I left Gwen sitting in the diner and drove directly back to the Grand Sovereign. The silver flash drive burned a heavy, powerful weight in my coat pocket. I handed my keys to the valet and walked through the heavy brass doors of the hotel lobby, mentally preparing to send the encrypted files to Harrison. I barely made it past the reception desk when a shrill, hysterical voice echoed across the polished marble floor. "Claire," I stopped and turned slowly. Marching across the lobby, looking completely unhinged and entirely out of place, among the quiet, wealthy hotel patrons were my mother, Catherine, and my younger sister, Olivia. The flawless, aristocratic composure they had proudly worn at the steakhouse was completely gone. Olivia looked absolutely frantic. Her designer dress was deeply wrinkled, her hair was a tangled mess, and her face was streaked with ruined running makeup. Catherine trailed closely behind her, clutching her expensive handbag like a life preserver, her eyes wide with a desperate, frantic panic.
"You have to fix this right now!" Olivia screamed, launching herself toward me.
She did not care that a dozen hotel guests and staff members had stopped to stare at her absolute meltdown.
"The federal agents just raided our house. They froze all of Andre's personal and business accounts. The bank called and said the mortgage payment bounced. They are putting our mansion into foreclosure, Claire. We have absolutely no money."
I stood perfectly still, letting her hysterical, high-pitched cries wash over me. The massive venture capital empire Andre had built on fraud and theft was finally collapsing, and the financial shockwave was actively destroying my sister's perfect, unearned luxury. Catherine stepped forward, grabbing my forearm with a tight, desperate grip. Her eyes filled with rapid, manufactured tears as she attempted to deploy her ultimate weapon of maternal manipulation. "Claire, you have to call the authorities and drop the charges," Catherine cried loudly, her voice trembling with intense theatrical desperation.
"Tell them it was a massive misunderstanding. Give them the software back. You are completely destroying your sister's life. We are a family. You cannot do this to your own flesh and blood."
I looked down at her hand gripping my arm. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I simply reached over and forcibly peeled her manicured fingers off my coat, dropping her hand back to her side with utter disgust. I looked at Catherine, and then I turned my cold, unyielding gaze directly to Olivia. "Like you said, Mom," I replied, my voice dropping to a smooth, chilling cadence that perfectly mirrored her arrogant tone from the private dining room. "Blood is thicker than water, but business is business." Olivia gasped, stepping back, as if I had physically struck her. The absolute shock of having her own cruel philosophy weaponized against her completely silenced her hysterical sobbing. I adjusted the collar of my trench coat and looked Olivia dead in the eye. "You should have been more accommodating to your superiors, and you definitely should have married a better man, Olivia." I did not wait for their response. I turned my back on my mother and my sister and walked purposefully toward the private VIP elevator bank. I swiped my premium access card, and the heavy stainless steel doors slid open instantly. I stepped inside and turned around. Catherine and Olivia finally recovered from their shock, rushing across the marble floor toward the elevator while screaming my name, begging and demanding that I come back to save them. I stood perfectly still, my posture rigid and victorious, watching their desperate, tear-stained faces disappear entirely as the metal doors clicked firmly shut. The 42nd floor of the Grand Sovereign provided absolute sanctuary for the next 48 hours. I spent Tuesday coordinating with Harrison and finalizing the explosive data Gwen had bravely secured from the bleeding internal servers. By Wednesday morning, the storm clouds over Seattle had finally broken, allowing bright, harsh sunlight to cut directly across the financial district. It was the perfect lighting for an execution. Inside the primary executive boardroom of Apex Financial, the atmosphere was a suffocating cocktail of stale coffee body odor and unparalleled corporate terror. Bradley Pierce and Andre sat at the center of the mahogany table, completely stripped of their arrogant swagger. Both men were sweating profusely through their ruined designer suits. Surrounding them were the 12 frantic members of the Apex Board of Directors, shouting over one another in a futile, desperate attempt to formulate a defense strategy that might somehow prevent a catastrophic federal indictment. The Securities and Exchange Commission had explicitly given them until noon to produce the missing compliance architecture, or face immediate, massive criminal fraud charges. At exactly 10:15 in the morning, the shouting inside the boardroom came to a sudden dead halt. The heavy mahogany double doors swung open with a loud, resonant crash that echoed violently against the glass walls. I walked into the room. I did not walk alone. Flanking my right side was Harrison, alongside another top-tier corporate litigator, both carrying heavy leather briefcases packed with lethal financial evidence. Flanking my left side were three severe, unsmiling federal agents from the Securities and Exchange Commission, their official badges gleaming sharply against their dark navy jackets. The silence in the boardroom was absolute. Every single executive stared at me in profound horror as I marched directly to the head of the table. I took the exact spot Bradley usually occupied. Andre scrambled to his feet. His heavy leather chair screeched loudly against the floorboards. His eyes darted frantically from the federal agents to my calm, unyielding expression. He raised his hands desperately, trying to salvage the burning wreckage of his venture capital empire. "Claire, listen to me," Andre pleaded, his voice cracking with raw panic. "We can end this right now. The board has authorized an emergency buyout. I will wire $20 million into your private account this exact second. Just give us the administrative keys and sell the intellectual property back to Apex. We can save the public offering. We can save everything. You win, Claire. Just name your final price." I reached into the pocket of my trench coat and pulled out the small silver flash drive Gwen had handed me at the diner. I tossed it effortlessly onto the polished mahogany table. The metal clattered loudly, sliding to a stop directly in front of Andre's shaking hands. "I am not here to sell Andre," I stated, my voice echoing with absolute freezing finality. "I already sold the intellectual property to your biggest competitor an hour ago. I am here to watch the arrest." The lead Securities and Exchange Commission agent stepped forward, pulling a thick stack of federal warrants from her leather portfolio. She read the charges with the rapid mechanical efficiency of a ticking metronome. Wire fraud, securities fraud, massive conspiracy to manipulate financial markets. Andre stumbled backward, his bespoke navy suit bunching awkwardly around his broad shoulders as two federal marshals violently seized his arms. The sharp, heavy, metallic clink of steel handcuffs snapping securely around his wrists echoed off the mahogany walls like a final gavel strike. He tried to shout, tried to leverage his status as a venture capital titan, but the agents shoved him forcefully against the polished table. Bradley did not even try to resist. He collapsed back into his executive chair, his chest heaving with loud, pathetic sobs as a female agent locked the cold steel around his shaking wrists. The entire board of directors watched in absolute, paralyzed silence as the two arrogant architects of my termination were physically dragged out of the glass-walled boardroom and marched toward the waiting federal elevators. The federal indictments triggered a brutal and absolute financial reckoning. Because Jason had actively participated in draining our joint accounts to hide assets from an impending federal investigation, the government swiftly seized his remaining cash. He was completely bankrupt. He currently lives in a dingy, roach-infested roadside motel on the bleak outskirts of the city. His beloved, ironclad prenuptial agreement ensured he was left with absolutely nothing, forcing him to eat cheap, canned food while staring miserably at his useless, rain-stained luxury luggage. Without Andre's massive venture capital income to sustain her toxic vanity, Olivia was forcefully evicted from her foreclosed mansion. The golden child who had mocked my 70-hour work weeks was now standing on her feet for 10 hours a day, folding cheap sweaters at a minimum wage retail job in a dying suburban mall. Catherine suffered the most devastating social execution imaginable. Her prestigious country club completely revoked her membership, treating her name like absolute poison. She was entirely excommunicated from the wealthy elite circles she had worshipped her entire life. She was left to wander the city, utterly humiliated, permanently ignored by the high society friends she had sold her soul to impress. I did not waste a single second mourning their miserable existence. I took the $40 million from the intellectual property sale and built my own empire. Today, I stand perfectly calm in my massive floor-to-ceiling glass office on the 50th floor of the Seattle skyline. I am the sole founder and chief executive officer of the most ruthless and sought-after corporate cybersecurity firm on the West Coast. Looking out over the glittering city, I feel a profound and absolute peace. I learned the hardest lesson imaginable during that freezing rainstorm. Having matching DNA does not make someone your family. True family is built on mutual respect, unwavering support, and genuine loyalty. It is never a toxic transaction disguised as blood obligation. You are never required to set yourself on fire just to keep toxic people warm. Have you ever watched the people who stabbed you in the back suffer the exact devastating consequences of their own absolute greed? Tell me your story in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories about surviving betrayal and taking back your power. Remember, financial independence and absolute silence are always the